Hey guys, so today we're going to look at section 6.2 from Panorama, and we're going to look specifically at indirect object pronouns. In the last lesson, chapter 5, we talked about direct object pronouns. That's when you substitute the thing that's receiving the action with a pronoun. So instead of saying I hit the ball, I hit it. Indirect object pronouns are going to follow a similar path, but the indirect object refers to the thing that receives the action of the verb. So the direct object was a thing that is being acted on, but now this is the person or thing that receives the action of the verb indirectly, answering the question to whom or for whom an action is done. So in the sentence in the example on the bottom, we have Roberto le presta 100 pesos a Luisa. 100 pesos or 100 pesos, that's the direct object. That's what's being lent. And a Luisa is the indirect object. She's the one receiving the action of the lending. So that's what answers that question. ¿A quién le prestó Roberto 100 pesos? The answer is a Luisa. So Luisa becomes the indirect object. The pronoun, then we can replace that indirect object with a pronoun, and they're going to look very similar to you. In the first and second person, both singular and plural, they're the same. Me, te, and nos, and os. In the third person singular and third person plural, it becomes le for singular and les for plural. No, there is only one option for each one. There's no masculine, feminine. It's just le. Le would be for usted, for él, or for ella, and les for ustedes, ellos, and ellas. So it changes for plural of the indirect object, but it does not change for masculine and feminine. It doesn't change in gender. Here's my favorite way of looking at it, my little verb tree. Me, te, le, nos, os, les. So le and les are the differences there. You'll notice that most Spanish speakers will include the indirect object pronoun and also the indirect object noun itself in the same sentence. And that's because if you go back here again, looking at third person singular, if I say le doy el libro, so I'm giving the book, I give the book to le, that could be to you in the formal, could be to him or to her. So to clarify who that le is talking to, we'll still use the indirect object noun. So in the examples, ella le vende la ropa. We don't know who the le is. A Elena. Now we know that le, the third person singular indirect object pronoun, refers to Elena. Les prestamos el dinero a Inés y a Alex. So we're lending money to either y'all, to the guys, to the girls, to a mixed group, right? So les is now clarified by using a Inés y a Alex. So it's going to emphasize, it's going to clarify, especially with that third person singular and plural, to make it really clear who that pronoun is referring to. Indirect objects can be used without it once that identity is established. And so if someone has given you a whole rundown of a whole story, they're going to identify, in this case, Elena one time, and they're not going to keep saying Elena every single subject because every single sentence, because now we've already established who it is. So aquí tenemos Ana le presta la falda a Elena. También le presta unos jeans. So those two sentences, you're going to understand that Elena is the person being talked about in both sentences. She's the indirect object of both those sentences. So if it's not going to be clear, then you will you or they, the speaker, will clarify who that le is referring to with the indirect object noun. And then from then on, as long as it remains clear, they'll just use that indirect object pronoun to replace that noun. You got to imagine this gets confusing when you're talking about somebody in the third person. And then if it's somebody you're speaking to in usted, then that also could be, they could be talking to you or about somebody else in the third person. So they'll clarify it the first time, and anytime it's going to be confusing. And again, they're not necessarily, a native Spanish speaker is not necessarily thinking through this whole process. It's just the way they speak. But we don't have to clarify every single time, as long as it's clear who that indirect object pronoun is referring to. All right, the same we talked in lesson 5. We talked about where you can put those direct object pronouns, and the rules are the same. They go before a conjugated verb, they go directly before the conjugated verb after all the nos in the sentence, right? So it goes directly before the conjugated verb. Nothing ever goes between the pronoun and the verb. And then they can go after an infinitive attached to it or attached to after a present participle. And then just a reminder that with that present participle, that's the IENDO or the ANDO form of the verb, that extra syllable of now this indirect object pronoun will make you have to put in a written accent mark to get pronunciation correct. So before a conjugated verb, after and attached to the infinitive or the present participle, the yendo or ando form of the verb. So the examples in the white box. Él no quiere pagarte. So it's attached to the infinitive. Él no te quiere pagar before the conjugated verb. Él está escribiéndole una postal a ella, or él le está escribiendo una postal a ella. So again, before the conjugated verb or after and attached to the infinitive or the present participle. All right, because that le and les have so many meanings, they'll often use that, just a reminder. And then because it's a person, a group of people, or a pet, you're going to need that personal a before there. So that personal a becomes a prepositional phrase, but that prepositional phrase is the indirect object. So yo le compro un abrigo a usted, a Juan, a María, a él o ella, ¿verdad? So a, because it's a person, needs to be placed in there. So le, in this case, le equals a usted, or a él, or a ella. Ella le describe un libro. Ella le describe un libro a Juan. Él les vende unos sombreros. Él les vende unos sombreros a ustedes, a ellos, o a ellas. Ellos le hablan muy claro, ellos les hablan muy claro a los clientes. So anytime you're clarifying who that indirect object pronoun refers to, you're going to use that personal a anytime it goes to identify it's a person, a group of people, or a beloved and cherished pet. All right, so we're going to look at some irregular verbs that are very common to use with indirect object pronouns, because the verbs to give and to tell or to say are often showing action that we do to people, right? So the verb dar, D-A-R, is irregular. Again, it's a three-letter verb. So if we take out the A-R, you just have the D. So instead of saying do, it's doy. We saw the same thing with ser, which goes to soy. We saw the same thing with ir, which goes to voy. And dar does the same thing. It is regular in all the other forms. It's just in the first person singular form that it becomes doy. And then decir, for to talk, to tell, or to say, we've already talked about. That's the go form. It's e to I stem changing. So it's digo, so it goes to go, and e changes I. Digo, dices, dice. Decimos, decís, and dicen. Again, that's the boot stem changing. Remember that from chapter 5. So it's boot stem changing, and it's e to I. E to I is boot stem changing, and the yo form goes to go. So these are very common verbs to use with indirect objects. Me dan una fiesta cada año. They give or throw me a party every year. Te digo la verdad. I'm telling you the truth. Voy a darles unos consejos. That's a great example because there we have infinitive, so it's attached to the infinitive. But to give, I'm giving you or her or him advice. Voy a darle consejos. And then in a negative sense, it's no les digo, conjugated verb, mentiras a mis padres. So in this case, a mis padres is clarifying who the les means. Okay, so take a second and just look through these first two examples that I have here. I give the suit to my brother, and I say the number to them. I want to make sure you do two things. Use the indirect object pronoun in the sentence, and then clarify it with the appropriate prepositional phrase using the personal a. So we'll just pause for a second, write down, or just think through what those two sentences would be using those two mandatory things, okay? All right, número uno, I give. So the subject is I, the verb is give, the suit is the direct object, and to my brother is the indirect object. Yo, the subject, le doy, le being to my brother, doy, the conjugated form of dar, el traje, which is the direct object, a mi hermano, to my brother. So that has to be in there. Yo le doy el traje a mi hermano. Número dos, I say the number to them. So you're going to conjugate this here appropriately. The number is a direct object, and to them is telling you which indirect object pronoun to use. Yo les digo el número a ellos. Okay. Again, the a mi hermano, number one, and the a ellos in number two could certainly be redundant and not necessary, except that in the instructions it said to do it that way. So, okay, here's what we're going to do. Number your papers from 1 to 10, and I actually want you to copy this down just like we have it. Okay, so either print the screen or take a second and write it, but this is a 3-part series of slides here. So you're going to, first thing you're going to do is to underline the indirect object. Who is the person receiving the action? Then you're going to conjugate the verb in the correct subject form. Remember, the verb's always conjugated according to the subject. And then next to the indirect object that you underline, I want you to write which indirect object pronoun you will use to replace it. Okay, so that's step number 1. So pause, go through these 10, and then come back, we'll take a look. Okay, we have yo limpiar la cocina para mi mamá. Para mi mamá is our indirect object, and that's a third person singular, so that's going to become le. The verb gets conjugated to limpio because yo is the subject. Número 2, nosotros lavar las tazas. Para ti is the indirect object, it becomes te, and the verb gets conjugated to lavamos. Número 3, ellos secar, means to dry. Los platos para mí is the indirect object, it becomes me, and secan is how secar gets conjugated in the third person plural. Tú haces los juguetes, para ellas becomes les. Number 5, Yesenia, lava la ropa, para nosotros becomes nos. The order's off here, sorry. Number 6, Pedro y yo, that's a nosotros, right? So we have our verb, ir, pasar. Aspiradora is vacuum cleaner, para él becomes le. So Pedro y yo vamos a pasar, and para él becomes le. Número 7, Lupe, that's third person singular, the verb querer mandar. Carta is the direct object, a su abuelo is the indirect object, and that becomes le. Lupe quiere mandar. Número 8, Elena is our subject, estar, enviar. So that tells you got to use both those verbs, right? A su hermana is the indirect object, that becomes le, and the verb gets conjugated están. That is incorrect. Okay, so now we look at the sentences, and we had 3 things to do, right? First was conjugate the verb. So number 1, limpiar, because the subject is yo, goes to limpio. Underline the direct object, mi mamá, and then that becomes the pronoun le. Número 2, nosotros lavamos las tazas, para ti becomes te. Número 3, ellos secan los platos, para mí, indirect object becomes me. Número 4, tú haces los juguetes, para ellas becomes les. Número 5, Yesenia lava la ropa, para nosotros, indirect object becomes le. I'm sorry, nos. Oh, I think there. Para nosotros becomes nos. Número 6, Pedro y yo, that's the nosotros, vamos a pasar, 2 verbs. La aspiradora, para él becomes le. Número 7, Lupe, 2 verbs, quiere mandar. La carta a su abuelo becomes le. Número 8, Elena está enviando, 2 verbs, right? El vestido a su hermana is the indirect object and becomes le. Número 9, nosotros. Y número 10, Javier mira las respuestas, para nosotros, indirect. Okay, número 10, Javier mira las respuestas, para nosotros, indirect object becomes nos. Okay, so some examples, identifying what the indirect object is and then replacing it with the appropriate indirect object pronoun and noting where to. Okay, so now you're going to put everything together. You're going to take those sentences, you're going to remove the actual indirect object, replace it with a pronoun, where it goes. For the words, for the verbs, the sentences that have 2 verbs, 2 options, you're going to place it both ways. Okay, so some of those, 4 of those, I think will have 2 sentences. But go ahead and pause here and now rewrite those sentences replacing the indirect object with the indirect object pronoun. Ok, muy bien. Número 1, yo le limpio la cocina. Número 2, nosotros te lavamos las tazas. Número 3, ellos me secan los platos. Número 4, tú les haces los juguetes. Número 5, Yesenia nos lava la ropa. Número 6, 2 verbs. Pedro y yo le vamos a pasar la aspiradora, o Pedro y yo vamos a pasarle la aspiradora, either before the conjugated verb or after the infinitive and attached to it. Número 7, Lupe le quiere mandar la carta, o Lupe quiere mandarle la carta. Número 8, Elena le está enviando el vestido, o Elena está enviándole el vestido. Attached to that participle with the mandatory accent. Número 9, nosotros les estamos tirando la pelota, o nosotros estamos tirándoles, attached accent, la pelota. Y número 10, Javier nos mira las respuestas. All right, muy bien. Hope that went well. If not, pause, go back, and try it again. Okay, last slide. This one is transforming. Go here are the instructions, and you will replace again that indirect object with the indirect object pronoun.
2. Transformar. Cecilia is shopping. Say for whom she buys these items using indirect object pronouns. Repeat the correct answer after the speaker. Modelo.
Cecilia compra una bolsa para Dora.
Cecilia le compra una bolsa.
1. Cecilia compra calcetines para nosotros.
Cecilia nos compra calcetines.
2. Cecilia compra un vestido para mí.
Cecilia me compra un vestido.
3. Cecilia compra pantalones para ustedes.
Cecilia les compra pantalones.
4. Cecilia compra zapatos de tenis para ti.
Cecilia te compra zapatos de tenis.
5. Cecilia compra una corbata para su novio.
Cecilia le compra una corbata.
6. Cecilia compra camisas para Juan y Martín.
Cecilia les compra camisas.
Okay, muy bien. That's the end of the exercise. I'm going to do something. If you notice here on this slide, on number 2, there is a typo. So if you will email me and tell me that you saw the typo on the last slide, Cecilia compra un vestido para mí, then I'll give you extra credit for making it all the way through the end of this one. There have been a lot of cuts and retakes on this lesson. So just email me that you saw the typo on the last slide on 6.2, and we'll get you some extra credit for putting up with me all the way through this. But otherwise, this is a great thing to learn. And hopefully this concept has made sense to you. If not, go back and read it, watch again, look for other resources. Everybody learns differently, but the more of your senses you involve, the better it's going to be. And let me know what I can do to help. Okay, talk to you guys. Bye.